wait, Rachel, do you want me to screen share?
Yes, please.
But wait, what am I screen sharing? Thank you. Oh wait, what is this? This is okay. Okay, yes, just this one slide. Oh wait, 3 slides. Okay, and wait, should I like cycle through them? Is that a yes? Okay. Nope, just the first one. Okay, all right, I'm reading the chat. Got it. Sorry, I didn't read that. Okay, I'm on it. Let me share screen. Sharing. Present. Everyone can see this, yes?
And we are live and recording, everyone. But we can give 2 minutes for people to come in for all of our participants.
Thank you, Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second event in our 2-week-long conference, Informal, Criminalized, Precarious Sex Workers Organizing Against Barriers. My name is Lorelei Lee, and I'm a sex worker activist, writer, and organizer. I'm a co-founder of the Disabled Sex Workers Coalition, a founding member of both the Upstate New York Sex Workers Coalition and Decrim Massachusetts, a researcher and analyst with Hacking Hustling, and a Justice Catalyst Fellow at the Cornell Gender Justice Clinic. The Sex Workers Organizing Against Barriers Conference is co-facilitated by the Disabled Sex Workers Coalition, Hacking Hustling, Cornell Law School Gender Justice Clinic, Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am so appreciative of our conference co-organizers, Rachel Kuo, Danielle Blunt, Zara Stardust, and Tiffany So, as well as our co-sponsors, the Berger International Legal Studies Program, the Dorothy S. Clark Program in Feminist Jurisprudence, the Cornell Labor Law Clinic, the Cornell student chapters of Outlaw, National Lawyers Guild, Women's Law Coalition, and the Black Law Students Association, Justice Catalyst, the Red Umbrella Fund, and the Asian American Feminist Collective. Special thanks also to Livia Folds, Naomi Loren, Eves, and Alexis Briggs for all of your work and support bringing this to fruition. I'm sure you guys in the audience can tell this has been the product of a lot of collective work and a lot of collective dreaming. Thank you also to all of you who've donated via the Eventbrite page. Our co-sponsors and our public donations ensure that we can follow through on one of our core ethics in this organizing, which is to pay people for their labor. In particular, sex worker organizers who do so much work that is unrecognized and unfunded. As I think you can tell, oh no, I'm sorry. For each of the conference panels, live closed captioning and streaming to YouTube will be available, and recording and transcripts will be available afterward at hackinghustling.org, where you can also find a schedule of each of the events in this conference. Our community agreements are adapted from the Asian American Feminist Collective, Brave Space, Collective Sex, Alt Div Hummingbirds, and By Us For Us, and are as follows. First, to bring in our histories and speak from our own experiences. Second, to be committed to each other's collective learning and growing. Third, to be open to learning. Fourth, to not share pirated work, including books, pornography, and any other art form. Fifth, to respect the diversity of our identities, which particularly for the purposes of this conference includes not assuming the identities of activists and organizers for whom sharing every element of our lived experience is not always safe. Sixth, to practice not using ableist language. And seventh, to prioritize caring for ourselves and each other. This last agreement in particular is a disability justice issue, and both our panelists and our audience members should feel free to do whatever is needed to care for yourselves during this conference, including standing up, moving around, lying down, or even disengaging from any of the events at any time. Many of our panelists throughout the conference are zooming in from North America or Australia, where we are living on stolen land that is still and always Indigenous land. To learn more about the land you are living on, you can look to the resources collected by the Native Governance Center, which are available at nativegov.org. Today's panel is called Sexual Gentrification Online, an Internet Sex Workers Built, and is the first of 3 tech lunch panels looking at issues of sex work and technology. The second tech lunch panel on tech barriers to organizing will be tomorrow at noon, and the third Eastern time, and the third tech lunch panel on designing sex worker liberatory futures will be on Thursday at noon Eastern time. For that third panel, if any of you are signed up for it, it's co-hosted by the Berkman Klein Center, and you will need to register through their event link in addition to ours. So Rachel will drop that link in the chat now. And also, if you have already signed up through the Eventbrite, we'll email you a link to sign up for Thursday's panel to make sure that you have access through Zoom. Our event today will feature approximately 45 minutes of conversation with our speakers, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A if we have time, and we'll answer questions that you have. You should feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A throughout the hour. So with that, I would like to introduce our amazing moderator and organizer of this event. Danielle Blunt is a New York City-based professional dominatrix and co-founder of Hacking Hustling, a collective of sex workers and accomplices working at the intersection of tech and social justice to interrupt state surveillance and violence facilitated by technology. She leads community-based participatory research on sex work and equitable access to technology. Blunt is on the advisory board of Berkman Klein's Initiative for a Representative First Amendment and is one of the 2020 recipients of EFF, that's the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award. So take it away, Blunt.
Thank you so much, Lorelei, and thank you so much for all of your labor and love that's gone into organizing and hustling this conference together. I'm deeply appreciative. So let's get started. Despite being early adopters and innovators of new technologies, sex workers are being excluded from services, platforms, and economies as part of a wide-scale digital gentrification, sexual sanitization, and displacement. Sex workers are frequently removed, obscured, or otherwise restricted from spaces, technologies, and resources that are accessible to our non-sex working peers. Technology, surveillance, and criminalization impact so much of sex workers' lives. The way that sex work is policed on the streets, both through racist, transphobic policing tactics and condoms as evidence, parallel how it's policed online through content moderation, shadow banning, denial of access to financial technologies. Sex working people who often live at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities survive or don't in a constant state of surveillance. This panel explores the proactive and unique role that sex workers as digital innovators and the grave consequences of sexual gentrification on sex worker safety and livelihood. And so on today's panel, Sexual Gentrification Online, an internet that sex workers built, we have Melissa Gira-Grant, Cinnamon Love, and Daisy Ducati. Melissa Gira-Grant is a staff writer covering justice at the New Republic. She is the author of Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work. She was a senior staff writer at The Appeal, as well as a contributing writer at The Village Voice and Pacific Standard. Her feature reporting has been published by BuzzFeed News and The Guardian, and her commentary and criticism has appeared in The Washington Post, The New York Times, Book Forum, and the New York Book Reviews. The New York Review of Books. Her essays are collected in The Best Sex Writing, The Feminist Utopia Project, and Where Freedom Starts, Sex, Power, Violence, #MeToo. She lives in New York. We'll then hear from Cinnamon Love, who is a kinky bi poly grown-up, a not safe for work content creator, and an AVN and Urban X Awards Hall of Fame inductee. Cinnamon is a 26-year veteran sex worker and the founder of the BIPOC Adult Industry Collective, an organization dedicated to the dismantling the harmful impacts of racism and wage disparity in the adult industry through financial assistance, mental health and wellness resources, and education. You can follow Cinnamon at singleinbrooklyn.com. And then we will hear from Daisy Ducati, who is a veteran sex worker and adult industry activist with a BA in interpersonal communication. Daisy has explored many facets of the adult industry over the last decade, from performing live and online to producing content and events, as well as being a founding member of the BIPOC Adult Industry Collective. And first up, we will hear from Melissa, and then from Cinnamon, and then from Daisy, and then we'll invite any questions from the audience. Whenever you're ready, Melissa.
Hey, everyone. This is wild. First of all, thank you, Blunt. Thank you, Lorelei. Two of the people that I would not be thinking about these things in the same way without getting to work with them. It was about 3 years ago today, exactly 3 years ago today, that Backpage was seized by the Department of Justice. And I think some of the people that I've seen showing up in the chat were probably hanging out online with us that day, just trying to process in real time what it meant to lose that website. It was also just a couple of days after Congress had voted to pass SESTA FOSTA, which hadn't gone into effect yet. And despite that, even though the President Trump hadn't signed that legislation yet, Backpage was taken offline because of a prosecution, which might sound kind of pedantic, but I think is worth emphasizing because a lot of the reporting around this and a lot of the ways some people even in the community have talked about this is that SESTA FOSTA took Backpage offline. And the reality is that was the justification to pass SESTA FOSTA, but Backpage was taken offline anyway. And I'm starting there, one, because this is the 3-year anniversary of that. Two, Hacking Hustling as a group came out of a reaction to that moment, both SESTA FOSTA and the loss of Backpage. And also because I feel like we're still living in the aftershocks of that moment. It's not entirely clear that we will go back to an internet that is friendly to sex worker advertising. Not that it was ever that friendly, but compared to how things felt in 2018, I think things feel even more precarious for people now. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and start there. This talk is something that I actually started working on in 2014 when my book came out. So it's kind of a prehistory of the sex worker internet, and it takes us from sort of the beginning of red light districts in the US, which is a way of segregating sex work in physical space, to the ways that the internet reflects basically 100 years of trying to separate and segregate sex workers from everyone else. So let's see if I can actually make slides work here. There we go. So this talk is called W for M, in a nod to Craigslist's erotic service section, rest in peace, the end of the American red light district. And that's how to find me if you want to follow me on Twitter or drop me a note after this. And I'll show that slide again at the end. So this is a photo that some folks may have seen or recognize. It's an image from one of the legal red light districts in our history. This is Storyville in New Orleans. And this photo was taken in 1912 by a photographer named E.J. Bullock. And he was taking photos of women who worked in Storyville's legal brothels, but it's not entirely clear like what this photo is. Like this could be a photo for an ad. This might be some like how somebody tried to entice customers, or it could be a photo of somebody resting after work. It could be like a completely staged photo that has nothing to do with anything. No one wore those particular striped stockings when they were doing work or hanging out, but it looks cool. But I share it because I feel like we have so little physical documentation of what this very brief time in our history, the legal red light district, looked like. And I think the fact that this is so ambiguous tells us a lot about what the whole idea of a legal red light district even means. So kind of contrary to the mythology around a term like the red light district, you know, you may have heard of things like the red light districts of ancient Rome, or, you know, the red light districts of like Europe before, you know, before prostitution was formally legalized in places like Amsterdam or in Germany. But the reality is the term red light district actually first appears in English in print in the United States. And it's really not as far back as I would have originally thought. So this is from the Sandusky Register, which is a local paper in Ohio. This is from the 1880s or 1890s. And the article in which the term red light district first appears is in relationship to the Salvation Army. So the Salvation Army, as far as I can tell from this, is in Louisville, essentially like trying to rescue sex workers. And that's why they're there. So the way that we first even like get this term in usage, at least, you know, in popular usage, is to talk about the activities of people who are trying to do something to sex workers, not something that sex workers themselves are doing, not a term that necessarily even they use, but fundamental to it is this idea of segregation. So this is saying the Salvation Army is limited to this particular zone, these particular streets, and they aren't supposed to go anywhere else. And I think the subtext of that also is like, we kind of don't want to deal with you, Salvation Army, coming here to rescue prostitutes. At least that's how I read it. This is a photo from the 1970s. I love this photo because it's from Boston, which also had a legal red light district. But it was a very experimental kind of legal red light district. So in the 70s, obscenity laws across the US started to relax, and different cities and different states experimented with, you know, creating segregated neighborhoods for adult bookstores and peep shows and strip clubs. And in Boston, that neighborhood got the nickname the Combat Zone. So this is Cody Lee. She worked at the Mousetrap Cabaret. And at that time in 1975, the mayor of Boston did this midnight tour around the city. His name was Kevin White. And he brought reporters with him on this tour. He went to strip clubs and he told reporters that my idea of a city has room for these places, which I cannot imagine any US mayor saying today, let alone then. It didn't last very long, this sort of like revisiting of the idea of having like a segregated place where sex work happens in cities. Once we get to the 80s, once we get into the AIDS crisis, once we get into sort of massive gentrification in cities, we see the end of this era. So even though it has this very particular context in which the idea of the red light district came to be in the United States in a very small period of time when it was actually legal, it remains with us, right? You see the remnants in certain cities of certain neighborhoods where sex work was pushed to the outskirts, or, you know, certain blocks that just still have that reputation of being where sex work happened. But the idea that sex workers use the city in a particular way to attract customers that's coded and sort of not meant to be understood by everybody goes back much further. So this is an image from a project that I was part of called the Aphrodite Project. And it's a reference to these shoes, or a reference to a practice that Greek prostitutes used to attract customers. They would, on the bottoms of their sandals, they would score a word or their initials or a message, so that when they walked, it would leave a trail and customers would know what that particular trail was. They could follow it to where they worked. It sounds like so completely rudimentary, but I think of this when I think of all of the different ways that sex workers have tried to exist in public space when they weren't wanted, and all like the coded ways that sex workers use public space, including the internet, to find people, and the signals that only those people would necessarily understand. It's essentially advertising, but in a stealthy way. To go back to New Orleans, this is what advertisements would have looked like then. So even though you have a legal red light district and you could go there and potentially meet people, they also advertised in these blue books, is what they were called. And here's one of the sample advertisements. They're not illustrated, so you won't see those like photos that we saw at the beginning, but they would travel even far outside of New Orleans. And I think of them as almost sort of like, a tourism guide to New Orleans. Whether or not everybody who had one of these books even ever went to a red light district, it's a kind of an artifact, and it's a way of talking about sex work that was accessible to people who wouldn't ever necessarily go. Moving ahead in time, I think this is probably the very first kind of sex work ad I ever saw, from like the Yellow Pages or whatever. I couldn't find like the exact one I would have seen in the 80s, but I feel like this is pretty representative. Though the ones that I remember seeing did not have photos. They had this like really cheesy clip art, like those lips. And then moving up to Backpage, this is a lineage of ads. This is nothing new, the idea of advertising sex work, even though it feels like every 10 years, there's a new sort of moral panic about it, as if this isn't something that sex workers have been doing forever, and as if it isn't something that has been a political fight forever. And it's as if it's not something that like we've even thought about in terms of how we design our cities and our neighborhoods and who is allowed to go where. I blurred out the vast majority of things in this ad because I think one of the things that was so unique about Backpage, and you can see this is an ad that was posted in 2014, is that you could disappear. You could take the ad down when you didn't want to be working anymore. And it made, for some people who wanted to work in this way, you could work in a very ephemeral way. And particularly now, when I think we know that sex workers' ads and online presences are so surveilled, that there's law enforcement technology that is even more sophisticated than we knew in 2014. The idea of being able to disappear from the internet, I think, is something very powerful and something that feels honestly impossible. And when I think about why Backpage was a target, I think that that's part of the reason why, is it gave people that power to not only work on their own terms, but to not have to like be known forever to the internet as a sex worker, be known forever to people in their community as a sex worker. I started writing about this stuff around the time this story would have appeared in 2008. It was around the same time that I was also still doing sex work, and the websites that I used and my community was using were under a huge political attack. And Craigslist was kind of the beginning of that attack. And one of the ways I think that it was made a very powerful attack is it started talking about the websites as if they were like a person or a place. So in this case, Chicago, the Cook County, Chicago of Illinois, that's in Chicago, their sheriff, Tom Dart, who's still out there and still active and still fighting sex work ads. He describes Craigslist as a pimp, which is kind of bizarre, right? Like, how can a website be a pimp? So you see that kind of language start to proliferate. So it makes something that's pretty neutral, just like a communications platform, sound nefarious, if not exploitative and violent. And at the time of this ad, or at the time of the story, Craigslist didn't even charge for ads. The reason they started charging for ads is because law enforcement wanted them to be able to track who was advertising. This is on the left, the taller gentleman, that's Jim Buckmaster, who's the CEO of Craigslist. And standing next to him is Richard Blumenthal, who at the time was the Attorney General of Connecticut. Now he is a senator. And was one of the major architects behind Sesta Fasta. And this is the story. I wrote about this at the time. The headline was not entirely my choice. I think getting sex work into a headline in 2008 was still a struggle. So what we have is Craigslist CEO, not a pimp, just enormously helpful to sex workers. The idea that anybody who would help sex workers, even if they had never even intended to, right? Like Craigslist wasn't invented to make sex work advertising possible. But then they end up sort of getting carried up in the stigma against it and made suspicious. I think in this case, because they were such a neutral platform, if you went on Craigslist to look for a sex work ad, you would find it adjacent to apartment ads, other job ads, things like that. And I think that was another reason that they were such a target, is because it sort of made sex work adjacent to anything else that people might be doing online, right? That's very different than a red light district where this is a segregated space. This is something that said sex work has a space alongside all other kinds of jobs people might be looking for, all other kinds of services people might be looking for. This panic of like, is a website a brothel? Is a website a pimp? What are we going to call it? Like, this is the New York Post deeming hookers turn homes into brothels on Airbnb, which I guess means that if you're a sex worker and you rent an Airbnb, whether or not you're doing sex work there, you have turned it into a brothel, I guess, just by virtue of showing up. And what even is a brothel anymore? I think this is one of the other reasons that this ad panic is so powerful, is because we're in a moment of disruption in the 2010s. The idea that there would be physical brothels anymore was, not what it had been, and police now didn't have physical spaces necessarily to police. So the idea of like trying to find sex workers by, I guess, tracking Airbnb ads was something that police had to adapt to, and didn't have to adapt to, right? Like, I don't think that anybody was necessarily even bothering anybody. But there was a whole wave of stories that were just sort of like unsuspecting Airbnb host realizes that their apartment was a brothel, which it just is a deeply stigmatizing thing. And as a result, sex workers were getting their accounts suspended, whether or not they were even working out of where they were staying. So that's a very different sort of way of like thinking of how sex work is visible, how technology drives the visibility of sex work, from something like Times Square, which I think of cities as kind of technologies. I think of spaces like Times Square where you had sex work adjacent to low rent apartments, adjacent to theater, adjacent to the New York Times. To have sex work in the center of our cities, in the center of our lives, is something I think that's really scary to people. But what drove sex work out of Times Square, the moral panic that was sort of similar to the one that took down Backpage, the one that took down Craigslist, it was about money also, right? It was about politics. It was about turning this space through gentrification into something that was seen as more profitable and more desirable for the city of New York. So it happens hand in hand. It's never just the police. It's never just the city and real estate interests. Police become an arm of those interests, and those interests end up engaging in policing, right? That's what we see online now, where you look at content moderation, which has the effect of gentrifying the internet by pushing sex workers out. But the lines are so blurry between content moderation and policing, community management. It's very hard to say, without actually saying what your values are, who belongs in a community, to say what that feels like. If you feel like you're being pushed out of a community, that doesn't feel like community management. That feels like policing. That feels like punishment and surveillance. And this surveillance is real. Like, I think that most people probably that I saw showing up in chat, this is not news, but like, the more that these low-cost ad sites became impossible to access, the more that sex workers had to build a sort of persistent online identity, the easier it became to be surveilled, and the easier it became to just sort of, for law enforcement or websites, to just constantly associate you with that identity, whether or not you want it to be known that way. You may have used your PayPal account once to get a deposit, and as far as they're concerned, you're a sex worker forever and you shouldn't have an account, just to use one example. I talked to some of the investigators involved in one of the Operation Cross Country ops around this time in Colorado. And, this was the first time in 2014 that I heard of not just the ad sites being targeted, but in this case, it was a verification site, right? I can't remember which one it was, but it was a forum where essentially you could only even get in if somebody else vouched for you and you were verified. And they had discovered that. So now we have police expanding their network even further, right? It may have been P411, I'm not sure which one it was. But that I think is what kicked this into another level of panic within the community, and one that we're still sort of wrestling with, which is now the ways that we work to keep each other safe, now the knowledge that we've gathered to reduce harm, that has become a vulnerability. That is something that's exposing sex workers to policing and surveillance. And this is old, but when you look at these two maps together, this is the Eros ad map. This is just where people are, right? Like, this isn't necessarily a reflection of like where sex work is happening. It's like, this is where like population is. But you see these things, right? Like Polaris will put them out saying, oh, these are the trafficking hotspots across the country. And it's like, that's just where cities are. That's just where people are. Sex workers are anywhere people are. But it's very powerful, I think, to sort of raise this idea of like sex workers are all around you, and isn't that dangerous? And don't you have to protect yourself? So for me, at the end of the day, like, this issue of gentrification, the internet, and sex work ends up having very little to do with technology. I think it's about politics. It's about values. It's about, do sex workers belong in our communities? And if you aren't starting from that place that sex workers do belong in our communities, whatever comes out the other end is going to feel like surveilling. It's going to feel like policing, whether or not that was the intention. So I'm going to leave it there because everyone else has a million other amazing things to say. But thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. Next up, we have Cinnamon.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. That was so amazing, Melissa, to see some of that, put the map, to show where people were working. I lived in, I was working in the industry back when I first started back in 1993. I answered my first ad for figure modeling in the back of an LA Weekly, which also had ads for phone sex and strip clubs and all of the things, pre-internet. We were advertising, people advertised in the newspaper, in the weeklies that would come out in the red boxes on the street corners. And I feel really fortunate to have been able to learn how to be a sex worker from other sex workers who were advertising in those papers, and having had the opportunity to advertise in that way. It's interesting to see how, quality of life crimes in the 90s impacted the migration from the newspapers, as well as the, street-based workers to the internet. People didn't want sex workers standing around in their neighborhoods, and they would get arrested for loitering or for working, on the street. And so the newspapers, allowed a certain segment of privileged population to be able to advertise very cheaply, to be able to work. And later, the internet allowed people to move from the street, those who were able to move from the street to the, and from the newspapers to the internet. And work more safely. The internet really allowed, not just sites like Eros and Exotics and, but Backpage as well, really allowed for sex workers to be able to to find independence and not need other people to, facilitators to book them, manage them, protect them from, bail them out of jail, the ability to share information, to be able to, sorry, there's like construction going on outside my window. It's a little distracting. But the ability to be able to work independently, to screen your calls. I mean, and not that we weren't doing screening prior to the internet. I mean, we were certainly screening calls from the newspapers, but the internet really did allow you to be able to access information in a way that we just didn't have before. Being able to look up someone's phone number, being able to look up someone's address, being able to verify that the phone number someone was calling from was in fact the number to their office. These things were it was really a necessary component to being able to be safe. I think a lot about how the internet also allowed people to work when there was no work in their area. The ability to travel from a city where your look or your gender identity, your body makeup might not be commercially viable in that city, and being able to still work and make money. We know that every sex worker can tell you that sometimes the city that you are usually working in is that you won't make any money, right? And so being able to get on a plane or a bus or a train and be able to travel and make money someplace where you are appreciated for being you has been such an important part of the dynamic for sex workers as well. And also just it's interesting. It was funny looking at those pictures of New York City prior to gentrification and the becoming Disney Disneyfied. Having worked in a peep show booth in New York City in Times Square at one point in my life, and then later turning to webcamming, seeing how the modern day webcam is really that peep show booth, but placed online. We can, there's so much of what we do today that we can see in the ways in which sex workers worked before. Being able to work independently as a phone sex operator, as opposed to working in a phone sex mega facility on Sunset Boulevard is, and getting a paycheck from a company, as opposed to doing it independently and just having someone take a percentage from you has really shifted the ways in which sex workers have been able to gain and maintain independence. There's just so much. Yes, I worked in a peep show booth in Times Square. My first trip to New York, I worked in a peep show booth for 2 weeks. But yeah, there are a lot of there's just so many ways that there's so many things I want to talk about. And I literally just stepped out of therapy before I came into this room. So it's like my head's a little swimming still. So forgive me for not being, having my thoughts together. I wanted to talk about some other things. I want to talk about some other things and I can't think of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to pass this to Daisy, and then I think I'll do much better in questions later because I think that'll be a much easier transition for me today.
Hello, I'm Daisy Ducati. I've been in the industry for almost a decade now. And I started out also working in a peep show. I worked at the Lusty Lady in San Francisco, and it was like a worker-owned cooperative. And we had a union as well. And it was an incredible experience. But even there, we found out that someone from one of the larger Deja Vu owned clubs was sent in to supposedly help us as a management consultant to sort of aggregate our business and help us do better, and ultimately cut a deal with our landlord to completely shut us down. So even there, we were dealing with like attacks from all sides, I guess. And from there, I went into online sex work and an adult film. And back when I first started, OnlyFans didn't exist, and there were so few resources for like independent online work. There were a couple of webcam sites and a couple of phone sex sites, and the promotion was a little more complicated. And I've seen many sites come and go. There were times that one website would be my main source of income, and then suddenly that website wouldn't exist anymore. And so one of the things that I learned early on as a sex worker, especially an online sex worker, is you absolutely have to cast a wide net, because the job is just so precarious. There's no real stability. There's no real sureness. You kind of have to be prepared for the worst at all times. And that adds a lot of anxiety to the work, because you just really never know what your job's going to look like tomorrow. And it's more than the regular anxiety of being an independent contractor and owning a business. Like, you really just don't know what is going to stand in your way. Like, even with OnlyFans recently, there was the situation with Bella Thorne where she promised things that weren't necessarily delivered on. And then because of that, people were upset that they lost their money. And OnlyFans put into place new restrictions on how much we can charge for content and how much we can receive in a single tip. And that greatly affected a lot of people's daily income that they survive off of. So we're constantly subject to changes of terms of service and websites disappearing and resources completely disappearing. There was also a situation recently with Pornhub. A lot of people that are outside the industry don't understand that some of us actually use Pornhub as a source of income as well as for advertising for our other revenue streams. And recently there was an attack on Pornhub, and it is a good thing that they've started to require accounts to be verified for age. And I think that's awesome. However, their payment processor was impacted, and now no one can receive tips or sell content on Pornhub. So it's only free content allowed on Pornhub. And there were many people that were making a majority of their income selling content and getting ad revenue and promoting themselves solely on Pornhub. So you just really never know what's going to happen. There was an award show during that time that they were having, and we were all expecting to stream during the award show and be able to receive tips. And we found out a day or two before the award show that we would no longer be able to receive tips through the website. So everything is just completely precarious at all times. It's incredibly important to sort of spread yourself out if you're going to be an online sex worker and work on many different sites and promote yourself many different places. And it makes the workload much greater. Because you can't just focus on one thing, and you can't just focus on one stream of income and create content and sell it on this one site and promote it on this one site, because you never know what's going to change tomorrow. And with social media, the terms of service is constantly changing. I remember when you used to be able to be nude on Periscope. I remember sending tweets from my phone. I remember times when it was okay to advertise on Instagram as long as there was no nudity. And all of these things have changed in just my time in the industry. With Twitter, they have kind of mildly tightened up their terms of service and put some restrictions on what you are and are not allowed to post. They still allow nudity. With Instagram, there have been tons and tons and tons of changes to their terms of service recently, and now they're starting to target even advertising dancing performances and burlesque shows and strip shows. And there was a time where the hashtag stripper was completely shadow banned and you couldn't search for stripper on Instagram. And it's incredibly difficult to even adhere to terms of service if it's constantly changing to exclude more and more people. And then with shadow banning, it limits our audience and our reach on the internet, which in turn limits our income. And if you post certain words or speak a certain way or talk about a certain topic, you can risk being shadow banned on any social media platform, and then you risk completely limiting your audience and income. And so you have to speak in coded ways or use secret terms or spell things in strange ways in order to try to reach the audience that's actually following you. And if the algorithm catches on, you suddenly aren't reaching the people that have chosen to follow you. And it can be extremely stressful and extremely detrimental to one's income. And even on Twitter and Instagram, if you're shadow banned, you can be search banned so that people that are looking for you actively have an impossible time trying to find you. They have to type in your name exactly, and sometimes your profile still doesn't come up. And when you're using social media to advertise your business or to reach the audience that pays your bills, it's awful to be not exposed to the audience that is specifically looking for you. So it's a challenge at every turn, and we never know what's going to change, and we have to constantly be monitoring the terms of service for every platform. We have to constantly be monitoring the rules for websites that we're on and our streams of income. And there have also been times that websites simply disappear because of whatever. A lot of times adult platforms have issues with payment processors, or another thing that happens is there's problems with investors and suddenly the website has to shut down. It's completely precarious and out of our control entirely. And if you are an online sex worker, you're sort of just subject to the whims of what's happening on the internet, and you really, all you can do is adapt and move forward somewhere else. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting, and it's a real uphill battle. And I think a lot of people think that online sex work is going to be easy, but it's a constantly changing struggle to put yourself out there and to reach your audience. And it's a lot of hard work, to be honest. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daisy, Cinnamon, and Melissa. That was really amazing to hear all of you. I just want to say that we're opening up to questions if you want to add them in the Q&A part of the webinar. But yeah, I think one of the common threads that I'm hearing throughout this is how, something to paraphrase what Melissa said, how technology drives the visibility of sex work, and then how the visibility of sex work drives further policing and criminalization. And it is this exhausting practice that Daisy was talking about, of finding the new way to communicate with someone, the new way to get your message across, the new way to connect with clients, the new way to organize and stay safe and share community resources. And I guess my first question is, with facial recognition technologies and verification practices and the dearth of advertising spaces online, how does the segregation of sex work from other spaces and the removal of many of the tools that sex workers use to stay anonymous and ephemeral change the industry? How do you see technology and visibility as a site for both harm reduction, community organizing, and a site of potential harm? And I dropped that question in the run of show doc if you want to read it with eyeballs, if that's easier. And or if anyone wants to comment on anything that any of the other panelists said, I think that'd be a great starting point.
Yeah, I'd love to hop in there. Facial recognition software, facial recognition in general is, when sex workers show their face, they make more money. That's undeniably, it is what it is. People want to know who the person is that they're seeing. Not being able to, people don't show their face for a wide range of reasons. But now with facial recognition software, it's becoming even harder for folks who do choose to show their face, because now you are at risk for being recognized by law enforcement as you're traveling through the airport. People are being stopped when they are going, traveling in and out of London or Australia, or certain airports, and internationally. Law enforcement, they pull your ads and they wait for you as you're coming through customs and will immediately deport you. It's one of those things where it's a catch-22. It's like, do you want to make more money? Or are you willing to risk your being outed by someone tagging you in a photo that winds up showing up on your Facebook page, or where your friends and family are recognizing you? It's to the potential of being outed to employers if you are also maintaining a regular job. It really, if you choose to do this work and you're showing your face, it becomes very difficult for you to have a life outside of sex work. The minute you show your face, it's like that is it's your image is permanently attached to sex work. And also you are at risk for being doxxed as well, simply because of the ways in which facial recognition software can then attach your image to something that you posted on a non-adult, your non-adult, non-sex work pages. And so facial recognition software really is challenging and to the industry. It's very dangerous to the industry. And it prohibits people from being able to have a life outside of sex work, if they're trying to maintain separate lives.
I have something to add just really quickly. It's funny that I think all three of us had experience working in peep shows, and what was really beautiful the time that I was working in a peep show was, was the early aughts. So definitely we were in the upward swing of online sex work. And there were people then even who were kind of doing both, like both camming at home or doing night flirt, which was like, I think, a big thing then too. And working at the peep show. But one of the things that made the dancers at the Lusty Lady first organize and push for a union was because customers were coming into these booths that had one-way glass and filming the dancers' performances without their knowledge or consent. And the staff, so there's always like custodial / support staff who are working outside the booths who could theoretically come and intervene. And dancers would try to flag the staff and say, hey, this guy's got a camera, come get him. And sometimes they would be abusive to the support staff, the guys with the cameras. So, one of the demands as they were organizing was to get rid of the one-way glass and for support staff to take that more seriously. One of the things that was great about working at a peep show, and is still great, I think, about working in some in-person venues, where you're not expected to sort of have a gigantic persona that you're selling all the time, right? You can try on personas, you don't have to have any online identity. You truly could go clock into the peep show and clock out, wear a wig, look really different. You could conceivably not be known to anybody in your neighborhood, your family, where you went to school. And that's increasingly being taken away. And that's I think putting more penalties on the persistence sort of someone's sex work identity, whether or not they're doing sex work anymore, even like whether that's like customs pulling them into interrogation at the airport because they show their face in an ad once and it's still dinging them for like advanced screening or something like that. Or whether it's like all these stories that we hear about sex workers trying to transition out of the industry and go get other jobs. And then the fact that they've done sex work because there's photos of it come up and that's used against them. I feel like the penalties on that are just like a scarlet letter, essentially, that the internet has accelerated, whether or not it was supposed to. But I think people who are interested in stigmatizing and excluding sex workers see that potential and have leaned into it. And that, like, there was just a story that dropped on BuzzFeed right before the panel about police departments using AI, like using Clearview AI as facial recognition specifically, and how they aren't just using it for law enforcement purposes. They're searching those databases all the time for all kinds of things that they are not supposed to be doing, you know, and just as it's a violation of their job duties to like look you up in the DMV database to figure out where you live, it should be for AI searches too. And we just like holding police accountable, number one, is like an impossibility, but like just the idea that police now have access to these databases that have scraped our photos without consent and can use that information to find people, even if it's not in the course of their policing sex work, which I think we are very aware of. But nobody knew, I think I could say with certainty in the early 2000s when they were putting their face online to do sex work, that would turn up in 2021 in a database that police had access to 24/7. Like we didn't get an opportunity to consent to that because it wasn't even something we thought could happen. And the irony that these like AI services that are surveilling us are like complete black boxes themselves. We have like no idea what they know about us. We have no way to demand to be erased, is a huge problem. And the idea even that we should have consent in that is something that I think a lot of people aren't thinking about.
I would also like to say that often this technology is weaponized against us and used to dox and harass us. And something as simple as a reverse image search could lead a random person on the internet to a lot of information about us personally and can be used to even physically harm us. And it puts us in a scary position sometimes.
Yeah, visibility definitely has a lot of cost in this industry. Thank you all for adding that. I think that when we're talking about gentrification of both physical and digital spaces, it's really interesting to talk about how algorithms or these black boxes code people as sex workers, whether or not they're actually doing sex work, similar to how, and I was beginning to talk about how sex work is policed on the street through racist and transphobic policing tactics. I guess I'm curious how seeing platform policing play out, and with the takedown of websites like Backpage and further policing online. Sorry, this question's all over the place, but like with FOSTA SESTA, we saw the removal of all of the free and the niche sites first. So I guess what I'm wondering is if folks could talk a little bit about how criminalization and policing, like who is it harming, who does it hurt, who becomes invisibilized by the platform, and who is able to remain visible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can hop on. Yeah, I mean, we see this, you know, Daisy mentioned Bella Thorne earlier, and the ways in which she was, you know, she and her sister actually were allowed to advertise their adult content on Instagram, whereas, you know, for the rest of us who do this work for a living and depend on this work for a living, you know, if we were to do the same thing, we'd be deplatformed right away. You know, we, you know, it's, and the same thing, and this goes not just, you know, isn't just racial, or even we see this happening often with people with larger body types. We also see this just happen in terms of celebrity in general. You know, Cardi B, who I love dearly, and I actually, I really like what she's done with her career. If she decides to twerk or dance around half naked on Instagram, she's not going to get deplatformed. But but sexy dancing is something that is a violation of terms of service on Instagram. And so, people who are outrightly selling sex, not necessarily for in-person meets, but even just for legal pornographic material, are banned from using these platforms in ways that are beneficial to them. And it's interesting that these sites are using they're using FOSTA SESTA as a very broad in a very broad definition to be able to dismantle the selling of legal pornography online. I go back to this often, but pornography has been declared and determined by a court of law as being separate from prostitution since 1988 in the U.S. versus Freeman, and yet we are still being penalized as if we are doing it, as if it's the same thing. We're seeing this now with these conversations about online performance prostitution is what they're calling it now, like in Wyoming and also in Oregon. And, but in that is really trying to roll back this, an already set precedence that says that pornography and prostitution are not the same. And so it's, we see that, Black and brown folks, trans, queer and trans folks, folks who are, fat folks are all penalized and policed a lot. It's in ways that other people are not. When you are a darker complexion person and your body type, your skin, it shows as if you have more skin showing in the algorithm, and so you can be taken down, you have a post taken down because it looks like you might look like you're naked because you have more skin showing or what have you. It's really it's fucked up, right? That we are over policed in these ways, and that you can't even advertise a. It's you almost have to think about other ways that to advertise on these platforms so that you can circumvent the laws and the regulations. I mean, I highly recommend for everybody to set up a single one-page website, not a link tree, because that is, you also cannot post adult content to Linktree. But I highly recommend set up a simple one-page website that has some brief bio information, some safe for work photos, and links to your adult content so that you can have a completely safe for work website that you can link to from your social media so that they don't deplatform you for the sake of linking to adult content. It really is preposterous that we have to jump through so many hoops when the internet has always been a safe space for porn. And part of it also is, I really, I blame the mainstream adult industry for not being more adamant about protecting the rights of workers, not going after sites like Napster back in the early to mid 90s, the way that the music industry did in order to get a handle on piracy. That would have eliminated a lot of the issues with sites like Pornhub in terms of having these having pirated content that, and user uploaded content would have, if they had jumped on top of piracy back then, we wouldn't be where we are today, where that's concerned. But we, and also, because the industry had to do such a, because the industry had to separate itself from in-person sex work back in the late 80s, in order to bypass some of the legislation, it really didn't do, the industry didn't really do right by those who were still doing in-person sex work, to be able to make sure that we also, that folks had the rights to be, the rights to work safely. You know, we've seen this happen so often that, you know, even within the industry, there's been this, you know, for a long time, there were people who were, you know, blaming in-person sex workers who were also doing porn for outbreaks of, you know, of gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, you know, without considering the fact that, you know, we are all adults having sex with other adults, both on and off camera, whether there's money involved or not. And so by not stepping up and, you know, working towards protecting the rights of those who are doing in-person work as well, it really has made it difficult for sex workers to even ply the legal trade online, because we're all being, whether you're doing in person or online or both, we're all criminalized and penalized and policed in the same ways. And, you know, we really need that the big money from some of these companies to push towards lobbying to make sure that sex work in general is decriminalized.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that we're at time. There was some confusion about if we were ending at 1:30 or 1, but with the lunch series, we were supposed to end at 1. So if anyone needs to hop off, please do. I wanted to say that our next event is tomorrow at 12 p.m. EST. We'll be on sex worker activism, barriers, exclusion, and organizing. And if we hope that you can join us. The conversation on Thursday will be RSVP to Berkman Klein. There was just a link that was shared in the chat. And then if any of the other panelists want to wrap up in the last minute or two of us going slightly over, sorry about that, everyone, that would be really great. Thank you so much for your time and experience and expertise and everything that you've shared. I really appreciate it.
And I'm happy to answer. Someone asked in the chat about the performance prostitution. There's a very small city in Wyoming that recently passed a bill outlawing performance prostitution, with the exception of OnlyFans, because of the fact that OnlyFans also has non-adult content there. And now there is another, I believe in Oregon, there's another bill that is coming up trying to pass the same thing. Like, they're basically just trying to say that that virtual or online sex work is still prostitution. And you can pull up those. If you just Google performance prostitution law, like you can find that article relatively easily.
I don't think I have anything major to add. I just want to thank everyone. This was such a cool space to share, and I hope we do more of this.
I was just thinking that too. This could have easily been like a 5-hour conversation. So thank you all. Yeah, okay. So I think it's okay. Does it sound okay to stop the live stream to everyone?